It's like you're here. This is experimental thing for me. Um, Teaching online. I hope you're all able to see this video on YouTube. You should have gotten a link on Google Classroom, and that's why you're here. So today I decided to just kind of go back through one of the hard poems that I assigned for last week we met, that Monday, where some of you were there and some of you were not. And I'd like to go through the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot with you today. This can be a challenging poem. Before I do that, though, I'd just like to remind you that, yes, we are continuing to go through instruction. It's going to be digitally. We got to deal with me talking to a computer. Going to have some online meetings. I'll give you some updated details on that. So be aware or be ready for some instruction on that coming through Google Classroom. So this is a reminder, your essay 1 is still going to be due on March 3rd. Sorry, not March 3rd, April 3rd. And in the middle of that, we'll start to read and discuss Othello. So just kind of keep in mind, I'm not exactly sure how scheduling is going to go. ISU has talked to me about doing some modifications for the standards and working at home, being you guys are now dealing with workforce issues, you're dealing with job issues, you're dealing with younger siblings, parents who are not allowed to go to work, a lot of stresses there. So, and maybe competing for bandwidth and YouTube time. So I'm going to try to keep this short. I'm going to try to keep it within about half an hour. So I'll just try to keep track of my time. So let's just go ahead and dive into the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up the actual documents on the Poetry Foundation website. And we're just going to look at the poem. I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to talk about it. And I'll just take you through verse by verse, and I'll tell you kind of what I feel this is saying. So anyway, this is, of course, once again, Poetry Foundation. It's a online free poetry compilation of really old poems and, of course, new poems. So it's a good place to find some new poetry if you're interested in that. So what we start off with here is the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot basically changed poetry from the Romantic period to the modern period. Now, it's really presumptuous to say that one poem could change the whole outlook and really create a whole movement. But it's not the first time it's happened in poetry, and it probably won't be the last. And so one of the things that Prufrock does, or at least cements the modern time period, is that it really creates the existential crisis. And one of those existential crises is that that we come upon when we become adults is that, you know, hey, we're really quite alone. We're not sure if there's really anything out there. No one really understands me. We don't really, we're not the center of the universe. You know, the universe is actually like infinitely big. We're infinitesimally small. And so part of the poem is dealing with that issue. So one of the ways that Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock does this is that it creates a sense of dysphoria. By, first of all, it's an English poem, but we get this smattering this section of Italian right at the beginning of it. And this is actually from Dante's Inferno. So this is a snippet of the poem. And in this section, there is a character who is talking to Dante in one of the circles of hell. And what he says here is, if I thought that my reply would be to one who would ever return to the world, this flame would stay without further movement. But since none has ever returned alive from this depth, if what I hear is true, I answer you without fear of infamy. So here Dante is traveling through hell, and he runs across someone he knew in life, and this person is being horribly punished, and he's trapped in this like wall of fire, and he can't get out of it. He's stuck in there, and the fire won't move. It won't allow him to escape. And what it's interesting here is that the person who's tormented in hell is more embarrassed by what he did to merit that punishment than the actual punishment itself. And so he's really reluctant to share what he did. And so one of the things that we kind of have to understand about this is that this is an interesting move for T.S. Eliot to insert not just a section from Dante's Inferno into his poem, but also this specific passage, which would say, okay, our deepest, darkest secrets, the thing that really characterizes ourselves, the true, honest revelation of our inner person, is embarrassing, is worse than the flames of hell. And only when someone knows that that person can never return and reveal their deepest, darkest secrets, their true person, to the living world, are they willing to share that idea. So, I mean, if we think about that, that's really impressive to think about that. So I'm gonna ask my wife to help me out here. I can't seem to return the screen share back to. Oh, there it is. Thank you. Stop share. So this is really kind of an interesting point, is that what T.S. Eliot has done just by creating this dysphoria. We have this section of the poem written in Italian. And then what happens is that we're not only further removed from the meaning of that, and if we didn't have the translation in front of us, we would be even further removed. We just kind of skip over that part, not get major element of the poem. And that's part of what the modernists did, is that they would say, guess what? I'm going to write a poem, and you're either intelligent enough to understand it, or you're going to feel alienated. And if you're intelligent enough to understand it, then you're not going to get the main point. Okay, so you either know Italian, you understand what is going on, and you can say, oh, well, I get that, which of course totally disrupts the alienation factor. But then if you don't understand it, then you feel alienated, but you don't get the meaning of the rest of the poem. And so you get the meaning, but you don't get the meaning of the poem. So it's a complicated trick that T.S. Eliot is doing, and it creates this mood of alienation, of dysphoria, of not being completely content with oneself. And so I'm going to go back to the screen here. And one of the things that we learn from this first section is that T.S. Eliot is sending us through hell. And he's sending us through hell so that we can fully understand what it's like to suffer, but not only suffer, because, I mean, life is about suffering too, but that we can understand this element of what it is to really be in hell. And of course, this isn't the hell of Christian reckoning. This is, or even the underworld of the Greek myth. This is the psychological, existential, modern man's hell. And that is that no matter what you do, no matter how you communicate, you're truly alone. So, what does T.S. Eliot do? He shares that loneliness with us. He puts us in the mind of what he could create as the most abject, lonely character he could imagine. And that's J. Alfred Prufrock. Now, in Dante, there's also a guide that guides Dante through Inferno, and that's Virgil. Virgil was the poet who wrote the Aeneid, and he also wrote a couple of books of poetry that that focused on shepherds. And I talked briefly about this on a couple days back. I believe it was Monday, the last Monday we met. And this was a certain type of poetry called pastoral poetry. They were the eclogues was one title, and the Georgics was another. By the way, the word George comes from Greek. It just means farmer. Oh, sorry, Latin. Sorry, wrong language. It just means farmer in Latin. And so one of the things that we're just going to go ahead and read this first stanza, and then I'm going to talk about kind of the loneliness that goes through. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. To lead you to an overwhelming question, oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. So it's an interesting element to start. First of all, we have this plural, let us go then, you and I. This is, of course, the guide of the Virgilian kind of like guide through hell. And then, of course, then we have us, who's the actual reader. And we are going to be led through the hell that J. Alfred Prufrock is experiencing. And it starts pretty bleak. The evening itself, I mean, something that the evening sky is usually romanticized. And of course, this is that breakaway from romanticism to existentialism or modernism. And the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Okay, so this is a person who has undergone the anesthesia of ether, which was a really a volatile form of anesthesia. Something about it is that oftentimes, like in the Frost poem we read, Out, Out, a lot of people would die taking ether because it wasn't very manageable. It wasn't a manageable form of anesthesia. Well, here we have this patient just kind of like etherized upon a table, and that's our metaphor that we've got to work with. And that's kind of a hellacious kind of image to start with. This is not a nice place that we're going to. And so we're going to through half deserted streets. It's not totally deserted. You're not completely alone. You're alone in a half crowd. People are kind of there, but they're not there. And there's this sense of muttering, restlessness, one night cheap hotels. That's, of course, pretty disgusting. And then we also have streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. And these are the great arguments. Typically, they're the arguments that are never fully resolved. These are the arguments of, first of all, what's the purpose of life? Where am I going? Like, these are the big, like, powerful potential questions that the child in us never really wants to deal with, and the adult in us really never comes to some sort of finite kind of like understanding of, and something that takes a lifelong journey to understand. And of course, that leads us to this overwhelming question at the end of the stanza. And our guide tells us, oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. And all of a sudden, we move. And we're in the mind of J. Alfred Prufrock. And so we move to a place that he's thinking about. And we get this funny little repetition. And it's this 2-line repetition. It's a funny stanza. It seems like it's out of place at first, and it's supposed to be out of place because this is actually a thought that Prufrock is having. So we're all of a sudden we've jumped into this lonely man's mind, and we have to think, okay, what kind of thoughts would he have? So the stanza reads, "In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo." Michelangelo, the painter, not the Ninja Turtle. And this is something that we learn about these women that he's thinking about and this kind of party that he's heading towards. And this is the kind of party where you have the upper crust, the social elite, the people who would actually visited the Sistine Chapel and seen the frescoes of Michelangelo. These are the very wealthy women and men who have not only know what they're talking about, or at least think they know, or at least have the social stamina to at least demand that they know what they're talking about, but they've also experienced it. These are people who have not viewed the Sistine Chapel through the internet. These are not the people who have a nice calendar of like Renaissance art. These are the people who have actually gone on the trip, had the classical education, can rub that classical education in everyone else's faces. And this is a party that Prufrock has been invited to. And one of the things we need to understand about Prufrock is that he's one of these people. He knows about these things. He's actually highly intelligent. He's experienced the world. He's also a poet at heart. And reticent about what he actually knows. And that's where we're going to go into his mind. So I'm going to continue on with the next stanza. "The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep." So this is kind of a fun, imaginative, poetic endeavor. These are thoughts by Prufrock. He's had that one little blip of the women at the party, and then, of course, he's moved back into the world of the imagination, the world where his mind likes to wander, the place where he wants to inhabit. And it's fun because this yellow fog, which is zoomorphization, basically this is taking a thing that's an inanimate object like fog and making it into an animal. And this animal happens to be a cat. And it's a cat that, of course, is creeping in along the sides of the streets and up against the window panes, and then curls and falls asleep. The important thing you need to understand about this is that this is a soft October night. Now, season matters, as Foster says, Thomas Foster, which you should have read, but, you know, it's being spring break and all. You probably didn't. He has a chapter 20 in his book on season and why it matters in literature. And as, of course, we've talked about days a little bit and seasons, October, it's in the fall, the autumn, the autumnal season. It's called the fall for a reason. Things die, or things are coming towards their end, which winter typically represents or symbolically represents death, where October, the fall, the autumn, it represents the kind of golden age towards senility, that ending of your ability to really command your life. And it's older age. This is what it's describing, and we get from this that um, that Prufrock is probably in his older years. And he's elderly, and we get that it's confirmed later on in the poem, but this is kind of that first injunction of that sense that, you know, his time's ticking by. So um, we move on, and of course the next stanza is all about time. And this is something that is almost picked up from a section in the Bible in Ecclesiastes, where there's this sense of, you know, everything to its own season. And so there's an echo to that particular section in the Bible that is indicative, or a sense of, not only is there time in every season for everything under the earth or under the heavens. This case, it's twisted a little bit and says that he hopes there will be time. So let's go ahead and read it. And indeed, there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. That's mentioning that zoopomorphized fog, that cat, that foggy cat. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create, a time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you, and time for me, and time for 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. And then he continues on back to that thought of, in the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Okay, so this is an important element of the poem, and this is, of course, his major concern. And it has a lot to do with faces and time. Time is a major concern. It's ticking away, but also this face, and he's constructing the face that he'll wear, the mask that he'll wear. He says, there will be time to murder and create. He's not actually talking about people. He's talking about himself. He's self-creating here. In time for all the works of days, works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. And so he's dealing with the possible conversations that he will have at this party. He's play acting them before they ever even happen. He's thinking about, how am I going to react to this particular person? How am I going to react to this other person? Oh, what if this person I happen to know is going to be there? They're going to ask me about this particular thing, and I'm going to have to give them an answer, so I might as well prepare one. And so he's creating those elements. And of course, remember, he's overly concerned about a tea party. I mean, that's what this is. It's a social event before coronavirus. It's a place where they have to sit and talk face to face. And that anxiety of interacting with these particular types of people are overwhelming. And that leads him back to that thought about the women coming and going, talking of Michelangelo. And so he continues on with this little section that he says, and indeed there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair's growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin. My necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. Now, the thing you need to understand about this particular section is that he says that he poses a question, and of course he's concerned about how the people are going to view him, and a lot of this is about them seeing him and not being able to actually see him. But then there's this section where he's asking a question to himself, and it's, do I dare, and then there's a pause because it's a break in the line, disturb the universe? And this is a question that a lot of us have to face on a daily basis. We don't think of it like actively on a daily basis, but we do it subconsciously. We think about, do I really want to fight that battle? And this is kind of how we vocalize this socially. We say, do I fight that battle? Is this a battle I want to fight? Do I dare disturb the universe? And this is a question that he has to ask himself. Do I dare to act? Do I put myself out there? Do I actually reveal who I am truly, or at least who I think I am truly, in order to undergo the active scrutiny? Active is a relative word. His imagined scrutiny that's coming from the other side. And so that becomes a problem for him. And this is basically the essential balance between the rest of the poem, is that we see what he's thinking, we see who he truly is, and yet the people he socializes with, they don't see this person he is at all. And he knows it, and he can call them out on it, but he never does that. He never acts out. He never acts in that regard. And so when we come down here, this is where he makes a fatal mistake. His mistake is, for I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall, beneath the music from a farther room. So how should I presume? And I have known the eyes already, known them all, the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And when I am formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways? And how should I presume? Okay, so here we have Prufrock's major concern and his fatal mistake. He says that he knows them all already, and then he assumes they know him, and yet they don't know any of this. And this is the revelation of this poem, is that we really don't know anyone. Really, we know what they say, we know how they act, and essentially that's the key to knowing anyone, is how do they act, how are they doing, what is their actions, what does that tell? Because people can say things and then do something completely other. We call that hypocrisy. And then there are people who say they're trying to do something and they actually try to do it and they fail. And some people ignorantly call that hypocrisy, and that's not the same thing. But here we have Prufrock making the same mistake he's judging everyone else of making, and it's that he knows them already. He knows and limits their capacity to understand him by saying that they're going to act in a hypocritical, judgmental, damning kind of like force towards him. And so he never is able to breach beyond this question of how should I presume? The question is, how should I presume to act? How should I be? And because of this, he's damned. He never actually moves beyond that. And that's what damnation means, is that you're never able to move beyond a certain point. Well, the sad thing here is that he isn't damned by in like a really angry God, like Jonathan Edwards kind of like sermon. He's actually damned by himself. He presumes too much of other people and doesn't actually take into consideration his own damning inaction. His inability to act is what actually holds him back. So he goes on and makes another assumption here. And this is, of course, comes down to the crux of the matter. And I have known the arms already, known them all, arms that are braceleted and white and bare, but in the lamplight downed with light brown hair. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? Arms that lie along a table or wrap about a shawl, And should I then presume? And how should I begin? So this is an interesting stanza, mostly because this brings in the love song part of the poem. We have to remember that J. Alfred Prufrock is going to this party not just to socialize, but to find a mate. He is there to call in a female. And so this epitomizes his loneliness. He wants someone to really connect with on a personal level. And in his judgmental statements, I have known the arms already, known them all these types of like physical features of the women, and yet he's still called by it, almost like and there's a real reference to sirens later on, but he's so distracted by them that he says, this isn't really fair. Is this perfume from a dress? Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? And then he goes on with his conversation, arms that lie along a table or wrap about a shawl, I know them all. And how, and should I then presume? And how should I begin? Meaning, how do I begin even attempting to court one of these women? How can I get to that point? And once again, he's damned because he never starts. Shall I say, I have gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows. He's waxing poetic again. He's saying, should I admit that I'm kind of a romantic, that I walk around in the middle of the night and watch people kind of like leaning out over their apartment like staircases and look at the smoke that's coming up? Then we get to this section right here, which is an ellipsis. And when you run into an ellipsis like this in poetry, you have to be very cautious and understand that it's there as a break. It's a subtle break. Well, this suggests a shift in tone. And in this case, we see the self-hatred that Prufrock actually has for himself. And it's in the next two lines, and they're separated by stanza breaks. I should have been a pair of ragged claws, scuttling across the floors of silent seas. So this is actually the second multi-legged reference. Of course, the pair of ragged claws is referring to a lobster or a crab. He's saying, I should have just been a crustacean. I'm not worth anything as a man. And then we come to this section up here where he says, I've known the eyes already, known them all, eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And when I am formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin? Okay, what do we pin against a wall? This is what entomologists do. They capture bugs, they classify them, they organize them according to that classification, and they pin them to the wall. And this is ironic because earlier, he actually talks about himself being pinned by his necktie, rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. And that pin and that formulation, and of course, his ultimate like despairing comment that he should be a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas, is that pin is a sense of order. It's also something that you can't escape. And that order is something that really is important. Not only when the entomologist takes the insect and pins it to the pin board, that insect dies. It's classified. It's known. And it's no longer this kind of like wild, chaotic, unknowable thing. It's classified and known. And what he desires is to be known. The whole desire is to be formulated. And yet there's this incredible anxiety about being formulated that he doesn't want. He wants to remain free, and at the same time he wants to be formulated, he wants to be known. And then it comes to that line where he should have been scuttling. Should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. What's interesting, the floor of the sea, that's the like epitome of chaotic, that is chaos. That's literally the water, the ocean is a ancient symbol for chaos, and here he is at the bottom of it, and he wants to be in a place of wildness, of unrestrained, like whatever, and that's not a good place to be. We come back to the end here. And in some publications, Poetry Foundation doesn't have it here, but some publications, there's another ellipsis right here. Okay. And of course, this suggests a shift between what he's thinking and kind of what he's seeing, or at least projecting. And the afternoon, the evening sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers, stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker. And in short, I was afraid. And would it have been worth it after all, after the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me, would it have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I am Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to tell you all, I shall tell you all. If one settling a pillow by her head should say, that is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. And would it have been worth it after all? Would it have been worthwhile after the sunsets and the dooryards and the spring-cold streets, after the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor, and this and so much more? It is impossible to say just what I mean. But as if a magic lantern threw the nerves and patterns on a screen, would it have been worthwhile if one settling a pillow, throwing off a shawl, turning toward the window should say, that is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all. So I read a large passage here for a reason, because it kind of captures the feeling. And so the feeling is that of being misunderstood. So Prufrock is so anxious about being formulated, and yet at the opposite end, he doesn't even begin because he fears to be misunderstood. Like, he won't even begin a relationship because he's like eternally lonely. Like, he thinks these great thoughts, and then he thinks there's no one else in the world that could understand these thoughts. So he doesn't even try. He doesn't even open himself up to the possibility of being misunderstood. And that's worse. That's a far worse situation than having tried and failed, as opposed to never trying at all. I mean, that's worse. That's a deeper pit of hell than what he could have experienced. And so, I mean, when you consider relationships, a lot of them are about communication, and so in that communication, if you're not trying and then failing to communicate, your relationship will fall apart. But you have to try. You have to continue to try to communicate your ideas, your thoughts, your fears, your feelings, all of those types of things, over and over and over again. And you will fail. You're going to fail over and over again, but you have to keep trying. Failure to try due to being, or fear of being misunderstood, that is worse. That's not even a relationship. That's the opposite of a relationship. That's the epitome of loneliness, because you never ever even made the attempt to connect with another human being. And that's a lot of what life is about, is connecting to other people. I mean, I'm doing it right now, trying to connect to you guys through digital medium. I mean, I'm literally talking to no one right now, except for my poor wife, who has to hear this whole discussion. And And so I'm like looking at a computer screen and a camera. But the thing is that you will watch it if you choose to click on the video, and you will understand what it is to try to connect to someone else and how difficult it truly is, but also how rewarding it can be. That's what Prufrock never gets. And because he never tries, and because he only assumes, he's lonely. And that takes us to the end. There are two biblical references in this passage that I read to you. First is John the Baptist. And that's having his, though I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought in upon the platter, I am no prophet. Now, John the Baptist, he was known for not holding back. Literally, the story goes like this. So Herod is involved in a romantic relationship with his brother's wife, Herodotus. And that's not good in the time period that he was in. It's not good now. I mean, people would still look at that and say, whoa, that's kind of wrong. And so what he does is he tells him so. It's like, no, you can't live this way. This is wrong. Everything about this relationship is wrong. Well, this ticks off Herodotus, who is like in that relationship with Herod. And Herod's the king. And she says, I want John the Baptist dead. And Herod's like afraid of the people because they see him as a prophet. And so he's like, well, I can't really touch John the Baptist. So Herodotus sets up. Now, I mean, think about this. This is kind of creepy. But she asks her daughter to dance seductively in front of Herod. And she does it so well. I was like, think about this. I'm like, this is just really gross. This is her uncle, for heaven's sakes. She dances in front of him, and he says, okay, I'll give you everything up to like half my kingdom. Now, you ask it, I'll give it to you. And she says, what do I ask? To her mom. And Herodotus says, she asks for the head of John the Baptist on a slaver. That's a plate. And so the thing is that Prufrock puts himself in the position of John the Baptist. And he says something interesting. Though I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I am no prophet. So he gives himself the punishment, but not the action that would have merited the punishment, which is action itself. He never even acts. He's like, I'm worthy of the punishment, but I didn't do the crime to befit the punishment. Well, it wasn't really a crime what John the Baptist did. He just said, you know what, you shouldn't be sleeping with your sister-in-law, and of course, being completely seduced by your niece, which is also gross. And so that's the first biblical reference. And then the next one is that he makes a reference to say, should I commit to a relationship? Should I actually go into this relationship in order to have a connection to someone else, only to be misunderstood at some future event when I'm trying to ask some deep question and not be believed? Because really, that's what it comes at the end of these last two stanzas that I read to you, is this repeated phrase, that is not what I meant at all, that is not it at all, that is not it at all, that is not what I meant at all. And so he's more afraid of the rejection or the failure of communication than actually communicating and potentially failing, or potentially succeeding, which is also the point. And he says, or he thinks of himself as so important, so self-important, excuse me, that he would compare himself to Lazarus. Now, Lazarus, the story of Lazarus is that this guy who was a good friend of Jesus dies, and 3 days later, Jesus comes by, is asked by Lazarus' sisters to resurrect him, basically, or to raise him from the dead, not necessarily resurrect, but raise him from the dead. And the interesting thing about this is that Lazarus has been dead for 3 days. He would have something interesting to say. That's the level of importance that Prufrock puts himself at. I'm going to tell you about the thing that no one else knows about. But he never acts because he's afraid of some future like solidified event of being misunderstood, of having a message so important, but never delivering that message for fear of not being understood. That's pretty pathetic. He goes on. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I am an attendant lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt, an easy tool. You can use the modern definition of tool there, or you can use the old definition of tool. Both of them work. An easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse. At times, indeed, almost ridiculous. Almost at times, the fool. I grow old. I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing, each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back. When the wind blows the water white and black, we have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us, and we drown. Now, I have thought a lot about these last lines of the poem. And it starts, of course, with this sense that we're in a play. And that Prufrock has a part to play, and his part isn't important. So he starts by denial, saying, I'm not Prince Hamlet. I'm not the existential genius. I'm not the real Renaissance true man. It's been argued before that Shakespeare actually metaphorically, or in not metaphorically, but mythically captured the true human, the whole idea of the humanistic person in the character of Hamlet. And he's saying, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. That's pretty sad. I'm not a person. I'm not complicated enough to be a person. I'm not worthy enough to be a person. I'm a character. And that's pretty damning in and of itself, to not be as complicated as you need to be in order to be a person. You're a character. You're flat. You're two-dimensional. You're not developed enough. You have no character, essentially, when you're a character. I'm an attendant lord. Notice that line. Am an attendant lord. I probably put an I in there just because of habit, but am an attendant lord. He doesn't even put the I there. I don't exist. I have no ego. There is nothing with me. It's absence. So, and this attendant lord is only there to move the scene along. He has no real purpose other than to move the progress of the play along. He's full of high sentence, meaning he sounds great, but he's stupid. He's obtuse. At times, indeed, almost ridiculous. Almost, at times, the fool. The fool is an interesting character. It's a completely different play. The fool comes from King Lear, and that's his name. And it's an interesting thing about the fool is that he has no true exit. He comes on. We don't really see him before he comes on for the first time. I mean, like, there's no indication that he exists, which is true of most of Shakespeare's characters, but there's no exit, no real exit for the fool. It's almost like he's a state of being as opposed to an actual character. And this is where Prufrock really comes down to the understanding that he's a fool. Now, this is the bottom. This is where you don't want to be, but this is where we all end up going at some point in our lives. And it's an important thing. As long as we don't stay there, we understand that yeah, we truly are foolish. We're not very smart, or we're not living up to our potential. We have been foolish, and of course, it takes a certain amount of humility to admit that to oneself, and then you move on. You build up from there. But the problem with Prufrock is that he's old. He's run out of time. And this goes contra to what he says. There will be time. There's no longer any time. And he starts contemplating, what do I do about, a bald head? Or, do I part my hair behind? Do I part my hair at all? Do I do a comb over and watch it flap in the wind? Do I dare eat a peach? Meaning, am I going to have the articulated skill in order to eat a peach? But not only that, will I have teeth to eat the peach? Those are the kind of questions. I'm going to end up wearing flannel, walking along the beach, and I'm going to hear the mermaids singing each to each. The most damning line in the poem is, I do not think that they will sing to me. Mermaids are sirens in many folklores and mythologies. They lure sailors to their death, either by drowning, or if they're naiads, that's the wet one. Naiads, they drown mortals. Mermaids lure sailors off their ships to drown in the ocean. Sirens themselves eat the sailors when they lure them off the ship. He's so despicable, that scuttling claw at the bottom of the sea, that mermaids wouldn't even see him as consequential, not even worth the temptation, not even worth the effort. That's how low he is. Put a lot of thought into the last two stanzas. He sits there watching the mermaids on the ocean. Of course, the epitome of like the chaotic order. You have this feminine creature in the chaoticness of the waves. And then all of a sudden he says, we come back to the plural. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea. Remember, chambers of the sea is not necessarily a good place to be in a chaotic, cosmogonic, chaotic world before order or the hero comes in and establishes order. We've lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us, and we drown. Now, that last line, I've put a lot of thought into it. And I think it means this, that although we can identify with Prufrock and his kind of sullen, hopeless understanding of the world, we also have to consider what it means to be Prufrock, to have some sympathy for him, because what happens is that when we're in the depths, we hear human voices, and those human voices are enough to call attention to our own existential problem, that we are just as alone as Prufrock is. That if we refuse to act, or if we are afraid of failure, then we'll drown. We'll never be able to communicate our true intents, our true insides, our true person, if we don't ever even try. And that's my reading of the Lovesong of J. Alfred Prufrock. I am planning on giving you some more instruction soon, particularly on whether or not we're even going to do presentations, on whether or not we're going to, how we're going to do Othello. I'm going to set up some Zoom meetings, probably not many, here in the next week, but we'll get into it a little bit. And please do your readings. That's important. On Monday, the 30th, you have Yeats's The Lake Isle of Innisfree, Stephen's Anecdote of the Jar, Adrian Rich's Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, and Hayden's Those Winter Sundays. And please read chapter 18 of How to Read Literature Like a Professor. It's probably coming up backwards, but there it is. Anyway, I hope this was informative enough for you. I hope it went a little long. Sorry about that. I wish you well. Bye.